So now we're back for the final section of this lecture on refugees and asylum seekers. There's quite a lot of confusion and misinformation in public debate in Australia on the terms kind of used around asylum seekers and refugees. This is perhaps a little bit less than it was in the past, especially in the 2000s. I remember a huge amount of media discussion about queue jumpers and boat people and all of those sorts of things. I think we might be doing slightly better about the way in which the media is talking about asylum seekers at contemporary times if we're not doing particularly better around policy in this country. But nonetheless, just to explain what exactly is meant by these terms, how we can define them, the definition of a refugee that we use comes from the 1951 United Nations Convention and the 1967 United Nations Protocol on the Status of Refugees. And this defines a refugee as a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such a fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So essentially, that's how we can define refugee. And each year, the Australian government allocates around almost 14,000 places to refugees under its obligations under the humanitarian program. So an asylum seeker is essentially a person who wants to be recognised as a refugee, and by being recognised as a refugee wants to be granted protection that they would be entitled to under the terms of the 1951 UN Convention, which Australia is a signatory to. So there's a huge amount of discussion of asylum seekers arriving by boat in Australia, but something that you may have come across, which I always find mind-boggling, is that those who arrive by boat are quite a small proportion of the applicants for asylum in Australia. Most actually arrive via air and come into the country with a valid visa and then go on to pursue asylum claims to be recognised as a refugee. So they kind of enter through a slightly different way, but the vast majority are coming via air rather than by boat, by sea. And so nonetheless, you would be forgiven for thinking that the majority of asylum seekers arrive by boat, because that's really the idea about asylum seekers that looms large in our national imaginary and that we always come across in our media, the notion of boat people and the way in which they are treated. So in terms of the kind of progress of the asylum seeker refugee kind of debates, and especially the way in which those who arrive by boat are treated in Australia, I've put together a very brief and broad history of offshore processing in Australia, so the kind of treatment of those who arrive by boat. So this font is probably absolutely tiny, and please bear in mind as well, this is a very kind of brief overview of some key developments. So there's a lot missing here, but nonetheless, it should hopefully give you a picture and maybe fill in some blanks if this isn't something that you have dedicated time to studying previously. So we can start our kind of brief history overview in 1992, when mandatory detention is introduced for non-citizens who arrive in Australia without a visa. And then by 1999, we have temporary protection visas introduced. And then by the year 2000, we have an influx of asylum seekers arriving by boat, especially from the Middle East. And pretty much all of them are held in mandatory detention. And then by 2001, the Pacific solution is introduced. And this means that asylum seekers are not detained on mainland Australia. They're instead kept in Australian-funded detention camps in Pacific Island states for a variety of reasons, but mainly to stop them getting onto Australian soil, which kind of enacts certain obligations to them and allows them much easier access to temporary protection visas and entry into the country. And so then by the year 2000, the Rudd Labor government abolished the Pacific solution, but still had mandatory detention, so still onshore processing. But then offshore detention was reinstated under the Gillard government. And then by 2013, the Abbott Liberal government introduced Operation Sovereign Borders, which was a big campaign to stop the boat. There were lots of ads put up in kind of refugee camps and sending countries saying, do not come to Australia by boat. You will not get to the mainland. You will not be accepted here. So essentially a huge concerted effort to stop people coming by boat rather than doing anything to address the reasons why they might be doing that. And then by 2014, the Australian Human Rights Commission demanded a national inquiry into children in detention because at this point, entire families were put into the kind of offshore detention facilities and were left in there for really long periods of time waiting for asylum seeker claims to be processed. So that meant that there were children in detention under the auspices of the Australian government. And then by early 2015, Human Rights Watch listed Australia as a country to watch for potential breaches of human rights, especially in relation to their treatment of asylum seekers, which is, quite unfortunate. And then by late 2015, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture outlined 4 cases in which Australia breached the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment in relation to the mandatory detention of asylum seekers. So by this point, the kind of Australian approach to asylum seekers is gathering, a lot of attention, a lot of international condemnation. And then by 2016, the United Nations repeated its claim that Australia's system of indefinite detention violates human rights to freedom from arbitrary detention. And they emphasised that the Refugee Convention makes it very clear that prolonged detention is illegal under international law. So essentially showing that Australia is breaking international law. So by 2016, in the same year, Malcolm Turnbull's Liberal government made a US resettlement deal with Obama, and that deal was eventually honoured by Trump after a very heated phone call and I think a lot of negotiations. So some of the refugees were resettled in the US, some have also been taken by New Zealand. And then between 2017, 2018, regional processing centres on Christmas Island and Manus Island were closed, but asylum seekers remained in nearby communities, and there was quite a lot of concern about the conditions they were living in and about their future. By 2019, the Medical Transfers Bill, the Medevac Bill, was passed, meaning that asylum seekers who needed immediate medical attention could be brought to Australia to receive medical attention. However, in an effort to deter further asylum seekers from coming or trying to come to Australia, there was also an announcement that the Christmas Island Detention Centre would reopen. And there was also the announcement that the Medevac Bill did not apply to any new asylum seekers, only those that were already in the kind of offshore areas that needed medical attention. So essentially, the government still kind of had their focus on trying to stop the boats. And so that's really the slightly sordid history of asylum seekers and offshore processing in Australia. So we can see the kind of, the kind of overall history of this, the very ongoing history. And now we can think about what might be behind it. What are some of the things that are behind this? And I think especially if we go back and look at the fact that when the harshest of these laws were introduced, it was seemingly in response to an influx of asylum seekers from Middle Eastern countries. We can make the link between a kind of fear of Islam, especially in a post 9/11 world, and the kind of fear of the cultural other, what's been called cultural racism, as being a really big factor in why this has become such an incredibly contentious political issue, despite the fact that it actually concerns a very small amount of people. It concerns, we have a lot less asylum seekers than we do, asylum seekers arriving by boat than we do backpackers from the UK who overstay their visas. So the fact that we don't have a huge, moral panic about the UK backpackers that are sneaking into our country behind our back, I think is quite illustrative of the kind of racialized nature of this particular ongoing debate. And so to bring it back to some sociological analysis, according to the social theorist Tariq Madood, the basis of exclusion of the ethnic other in the Western state is determined by the extent to which a cultural group is seen as belonging. So the extent to which they're seen as being part of this particular state. So when there's a moral panic, essentially about terrorism fears in kind of link to Islam as religion, this becomes a contemporary form of kind of cultural racism, of a view of Islam and therefore of Islamic people as other due to their specific culture. And so there's been some research that's kind of backed up the notion of cultural racism and Islamophobia in Australia. So, for instance, Broadbent has, in 2013, found there was kind of quite widespread support for the idea that Muslim Australians are potential terrorists. And yet, this is, despite the fact that Australia has seen quite a small number of cases and convictions of Islamic terrorists. And there's been also a very strong kind of public reaction to fears of Islamic terrorism, especially between 2001 and 2014. There were 64 pieces of counterterrorism legislation that entered into Australian law. So you might argue that compared to other threats to social order and to the community, perhaps that's disproportionate when we look at how we legislate against and react to other threats. In 2014, a study found that 1 in 4 Australians held negative views of Muslims, and they also found that Muslims experience discrimination at 3 times the rate of other members of the kind of wider Australian community. And then in a finding that I think is really quite telling, a 2014 poll found that many Australians believe that Muslims make up at least 18% of the population. And this is in contrast to the fact that they, in the 2014 census, only made up a little bit over 2% of the population. So all of these things taken together appear to demonstrate something of a moral panic about Muslims. There obviously, in some cases, are some cases in which there has been Muslims committing terrorist acts, but there's obviously been people of all races and nationalities committing various types of socially undesirable acts, and they have not received the same social reaction or even a similar social reaction. So perhaps we can frame this as a moral panic. If you think back to the week on youth, in which Steve talked a bit about moral panics, this does seem to fit the criteria of a moral panic in that sense. But there's quite a lot of research being conducted that can start to challenge or kind of unravel Islamophobia, or at least challenge the basis of this and the logic on which it is founded. So research has found that Muslim Australians predominantly support the principle and practice of democracy. So very much in contrast to someone like Pauline Hanson, who's arguing that we might eventually have Sharia law in Australia. That does not seem to be something that is at all desired by Muslim Australians. So not really on the cards. And other authors have found that there's not really any empirical evidence in Australia that supports the case for widespread radicalisation or vulnerability to radicalisation among Australian Muslims. There's not even really too much evidence to support widespread alienation of this community. So the arguments that Australian Muslims are kind of vulnerable to being radicalised, being recruited by ISIS and all of that, when researchers have dug into that and tried to look like, is this actually the case? How much truth is there to these types of ideas? They haven't really found very much evidence at all. And researchers also found that Muslim Australians, while they kind of value their Islamic identity as you'd hope and as they should, they also actively seek to integrate into mainstream Australian society. So there's not really the kind of sense of Muslim communities as like creating their own communities, as failing to integrate, all of these negative things that are often associated with immigrant groups, a kind of failure of assimilation. Among Muslim Australians, there's quite a strong desire for assimilation, which isn't in of itself something that we should be saying like, oh, so they should. That's more to say that the type of arguments that are made around Muslim Australians and a dangerous identity are not really backed up when they're interrogated by research. So basically there's not a huge amount of evidence, systematic evidence, rather than single isolated cases for the kind of Islamophobia that we see, and that seems to, in some cases, underpin the approach to asylum seekers, and especially those that arrive by sea. So I think just to kind of sum up what I've spoken to you about today, because I know I've covered a lot of areas. So I think the kind of main take-home messages that I'd like you to keep in mind and carry forward from our lecture this week is to start off with that the concept of race is contested. It is not a kind of cut and dry concept, but really, as a sociologist and as budding sociologists, we are really interested in how race is socially constructed and the social effects that it has in the world. Whether or not race has a biological basis is not really of primary importance to us, because we're interested in the social world. We're interested in providing, asking social questions, providing social explanations. So that's really, our particular realm of interest. And so that's where our interest in race is really situated. Also, another take-home message is that race and ethnicity have slightly different meanings, although they're often used interchangeably. So race is generally used to describe physical, like whether real or perceived physical differences, whereas ethnicity is used to describe what we do, the kind of cultural practices of identity that we engage in, the food we eat, the languages we speak, the clothes that we wear, all of those sorts of things. And we all have an ethnicity. We all belong to an ethnic group. That's not just something that some people have and some don't. It's a human condition. And one of the most kind of active spaces in which issues of race, ethnicity, multiculturalism, belonging all kind of come together, all intersect, is in contemporary debates in relation to Australia and asylum seekers and refugees. This is a really contentious issue, and I think it can tell us a lot about the kind of state of race and ethnicity and ideas about migration and multiculturalism in Australia. There's obviously many more issues at play that are separate from that, but I think that particular issue is really worth examining. If nothing else, it's something that we shouldn't necessarily look away from, because as we've seen in the timeline I took you through, this is an area in which Australia is really kind of falling down on its human rights obligations, and that's incredibly significant. So I think it's something that needs to be thought about, needs to be spoken about, needs to be considered, and shouldn't kind of drop off the agenda just because it's been happening for at least for about 30 years now. It's still important and relevant and very much in need of study and attention. And then finally, debates about asylum seekers are seemingly both informed by and reinforce Islamophobia, so concerns about the kind of spectre of the Muslim other. But these types of views are not necessarily backed up by research, by like the empirical realities that we can find through research. And so one way in which we can challenge this Islamophobia, this kind of fear of the other, is through social science research. So a really powerful tool we have to interrogate these views and see, are they actually substantiated, or are they just based on fear, based on media reporting, based on a whole range of things. So that's about all I wanted to cover today, but thank you so much for listening. And yeah, I will see you the week after next to talk to you about the media, which I think will be very, very interesting. It's certainly a really fascinating time to be thinking critically about the media at present, so I'm looking forward to it. And please have a look at the library resources. I promise they are really helpful.